The U.S. withdrawal from Syria presents many challenges for the region. It could lead to instability and a new round of chaos. However, from Trump's point of view, this has been a mission accomplished moment against ISIS. In some ways, the U.S. campaign in Syria should be seen as a success. It was smarter, leaner, and faster. The U.S. was able to help the Syrian Democratic Forces and the People's Protection Units, its main partners in Syria, defeat ISIS with a minimal number of troops, eventually just a few thousand, and almost no casualties. I think that represents, in some ways, the new method of warfighting for the U.S., what's called by, with, and through. Advise and assist, where basically you send just a few people that help to be a force multiplier, along with air power and all sorts of other technology that allows you to bring all of the major weapons systems that the U.S. has to bear against these kind of enemies, this kind of asymmetric warfare. We know from congressional testimony that there are U.S. special forces in around 90 countries in the world that consist of around 8,000 operators. So we know that the U.S. is already doing this in many places. Now, the question about eastern Syria is, what would have happened had there been no YPG or SDF there? Certainly there were many lobbies in Washington that thought the U.S. main partner should be the Syrian rebels or the opposition or Turkey. But those groups didn't seem to ever make ISIS fighting a priority. Now, some would have argued that, well, perhaps fighting ISIS wasn't a priority, but we have to remember that the U.S. got involved in eastern Syria initially in 2014 to stop the Yazidi genocide and began bombing ISIS next to Kobani in that battle that the Kurds were waging when they were under siege on the Turkish border. That's how the mission creep kind of began. We need to understand, of course, how we got here, which is that from that just few number of airstrikes, the U.S. began supplying small arms and then special forces, and then in fact encouraged the YPG to create this kind of SDF umbrella of forces, specifically because the U.S. didn't want to work with the PYD directly. It didn't want to be directly connected to what was the Syrian version of the PKK. It understood the Turkish concerns, and that was in 2015 when Turkey was fighting a brutal insurgency against the PKK in eastern Turkey. So we need to understand that obviously that played into the U.S. decision-making regarding Syria. That's kind of how the U.S. got here, but along the way, the United States also began to put down a diplomatic footprint. It began to invest in reconstruction, stabilization. It also saw using eastern Syria as some sort of a leverage. But it also had a sort of Janus face, where it used to tell Turkey and other countries, well, this is just a transactional, temporary, and tactical relationship. At the same time, of course, thousands of fighters from the mostly Kurdish SDF had fought and died alongside Americans. And this seems like a momentous betrayal. Now, it's worth noting that some have said, well, yeah, but what is the U.S. doing here? Why do we need to be in Syria? Isn't this just another conflict? And that's a worthwhile question to ask. However, the question is, okay, but the Russians are also in eastern Syria. Well, they're not in eastern Syria, but they're in the rest of Syria. So by leaving Syria, Russia is handed a major victory. I recall in 2012 or so, there was a cartoon in a U.S. newspaper showing an American CIA member going into Syria and showing a Russian KGB type there. And he was saying, "Hi, Boris." And it was supposed to allude to the 1990s fight or 1980s fight against the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. Well, in this round, the Russians seem to have won, and the Russians seem to have won not by sending tens of thousands of soldiers there. They have an air force, and they had some special forces and some contractors. But they've won by having a clear mission, which is the support of the Syrian regime. whereas the U.S. has had something like 4 or 5 different missions. It wants to defeat ISIS, it wants to support the Syrian rebels, it wants to work with Turkey, it also wants to deal with Iran, it also wants to stabilize. It had too many different things it wanted to do. So that's a lesson, I think, in terms of U.S. policymaking, which is that you can't try to do everything. And I think also the U.S., if you listen to the statements of James Jeffrey, the envoy, or even the prior administration under John Kerry, the U.S. sort of believed in this Geneva process, which was never going anywhere. And little by little, the U.S. was sidelined by Russia and Turkey and Iran. So we need to understand how that happened and see that this is not just a Trump decision, it's also something that the State Department didn't exactly know what it was doing. And I think it also worked sometimes at counter purposes with the Defense Department, and they never had a unified mission. And the United States, too often, I think, in the last, decades or so, has had this problem of not having a clear mission in which all parts of the U.S. government work together. Instead, each part fights its own war. The CIA has its own friends. The State Department has its own friends. The Pentagon has its friends. The White House is doing something different. And you can't have a U.S. policy like that, because countries like Russia or Turkey or whomever, whether they're adversaries or even ostensibly friends that have different goals than you, those countries will always outplay you at the table because they know what they want. And the United States doesn't always know what it wants. And I think that in the end of the day also, the U.S. sometimes lacks a bit of also human interest here, which is that you have this SDF and YPG that helped you liberate all the Yazidis and save tens of thousands of people. If they hadn't done that in 2014, not only would there be tens of thousands of more people dead, but there would have been a huge humanitarian catastrophe that the U.S. would have had to go there and help out with anyway. So they actually saved the U.S. what's called blood and treasure. This idea that, well, the U.S. doesn't need to be in Syria, why are we wasting lives? But the fact is the U.S. didn't have to waste very many lives because these groups there were so effective at fighting ISIS. And the question mark now remains afterward, will this lead to a new round of chaos and instability? Will ISIS be able to see this as a major victory? Or will Russia and Iran and Turkey just fill this vacuum somehow seamlessly? And, U.S. will suffer yet again another slight setback and loss of influence.